Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Tuccaro. I'm the co-vice president for IPPNW North America and board member for IPPNW Canada. I'd like to welcome you to our speaker series. This is a monthly program. Tonight, we're very happy to present War, Climate Fairness, and Planetary Health, and question whether the COP process may be harmful. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada is the national affiliate of IPPNW International and a member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. The commitment we have is to education and research about humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, militarism, and climate change. In our commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons and the prevention of war, we promote nonviolent means of conflict resolution and social justice for a sustainable world. We live, work, and play on Turtle Island, later known as North America or Canada. And I'm speaking to you from the stolen lands of the Coast Salish peoples. They knew and still do know how to take care of this beautiful place. They understood what has real value. And they made a contract with the salmon because of this understanding. And they agreed that they would care for the streams, rivers, oceans, trees, and all those things that connect, show gratitude and humility in the face of the abundance of all of that around them. And in return, the salmon would allow themselves to be fished at the same time every year, year after year. The heads and bones are ceremoniously returned to the waters in thanks. It is a reciprocal relationship. Their technology of fish wares and traps would have permitted them to take many more fish at each run, but they did not do that. They took only what they needed and returned what they did not. In 175 years, the settlers, we settlers, have nearly wiped out the salmon. We have so much to learn. With this recognition of our place on the planet, I'd like to welcome my friend and colleague, Linda Thayer. Linda is a family physician, mother, and outstanding colleague in this work. Linda will be moderating the progress tonight, and I'll turn it over to her. Linda, thank you, and thanks to all the panel for being here tonight.
Thank you, Tim, for the kind introduction. And your land acknowledgement draws a little bit of the connection or I guess the mindset change that perhaps we need to look at, where both the issue of war and militarism and climate change sort of underscore the mindset of domination over humans or domination over the natural environment, and our wishes to try to control other humans or the environment, our living home. And many thanks for the honor of moderating this really important discussion where war and militarism meet up with climate change and the ecological crisis. I thought I'd give just a little bit of a historical context to today's discussion. It was around 60 years ago that interest really started to grow in the fact that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were slowly creeping up and impacting the climate. And climate scientists started to talk to governments about it with the intent to change policy to stabilize carbon emissions, which were even back then known to be caused by burning fossil fuels. So people started to organize, and then in 1988, the UN and the World Meteorological Organization formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which was responsible for assessing and reporting on the science of climate change. And after the first IPCC report, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was drawn up as the first international treaty to form a framework for cooperation amongst countries, with a goal to limit greenhouse gas emissions and thus limit the increases in global temperatures. And in 1995, that's nearly 30 years ago, the first official Conference of the Parties, or COP, meeting was held for all the signatories of that convention, and the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. And this protocol was a legally binding agreement between the signing countries to count and report their CO2 emissions and to set targets to reduce those emissions. In the Kyoto Protocol, though, military emissions were excluded from reporting under pressure from the US, who indicated that other countries could possibly deduce what the US military's activities might be based on their emissions, and thus risking security. In the 2015 Paris Agreement, when that was drawn up and agreed upon at the 20th COP, once again, military emissions were omitted from obligatory reporting. So the over 190 countries that were signing on to the global agreements have no obligation to report the emissions from their military. And this is what many call the military emissions gap. Some countries have voluntarily provided partial reports, including, funnily enough, the US, along with the UK and Germany and some others. But many other countries, which have a substantial portion of their budget allocated to military, are not reporting, such as India and China. So what might be the consequences of emitting these military emissions? It means that an estimated 5.5% of global greenhouse gases go unreported. That's the estimated portion of global emissions that are coming from militaries. It means that since this data is being ignored and not factored into emissions and reductions by many countries, the calculations around the values and the goals for net zero will likely be off by that amount as well. And it means that the reduction strategies will likely be off as well by that same amount, and the calculations will be erroneous, and the solutions may miss the true mark. This intentional omission has other more subtle and somewhat nefarious possible consequences as well. By giving this free pass to militarized violence, the UN and COP may be seen as confirming or affirming the validity of war and militarized violence, hinting that the military is above scrutiny, at least in terms of its ecological footprint. And that can be a very dangerous way to live. This practice quietly allows the impacts of war on the environment to be ignored. It may indicate that permission is granted to ignore the destruction of habitats, the poisoning and contamination of air, water, and soil, which have been shown to last for years, decades, and even centuries after a war, and the massive contribution to global warming through carbon emissions related to militaries, from the manufacturing of weapons and equipment to military practice exercises, where, for instance, burning jet fuel is reportedly the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US military, to the emissions related to the activities of war itself, and to the emissions and natural resources needed to rebuild after war. This clause of exception in the Kyoto and Paris agreements may also be interpreted as an implicit acceptance by this UN body of preparations for war, and that militarized violence may be an acceptable solution to conflict. In these times of global climate instability, as more and more people are displaced and on the move due to climate-related extreme weather events, and there is a greater grab for resources as they become increasingly scarce, we can expect to see increasing conflict. And how we manage these conflicts can have a big impact on people as well as on the land and its non-human beings. And the outcome can be quite different if we focus on equitably meeting everyone's needs by working together and sharing resources than if we use military force. And the effects of how we manage these conflicts in a peaceful versus a violent way has impacts on physical and mental health that cascade through generations. So at a time when global collaboration is essential to try to move through the disruptions of climate change in a good way, any allowances for behaviors that feed the division amongst global parties can be harmful. My final point regarding the consequences of this emissions gap relates to climate justice and fairness, which has been the focus of the more recent COPs, in which there have been attempts to have the countries with greater emissions and contributions to climate change contribute funds towards the countries which have contributed much less to the crisis but are bearing the brunt of climate change. Overall, that support hasn't materialized in a substantial way, but we do know that in 2023, the global military budget was 2.44 trillion in US dollars. And imagine what could be accomplished if that amount was put to a different use. So we're thrilled to have two special guests here today who will dive into some of these aspects now. We're so honored to have the perspectives of Anjali Appadurai and Bimal Khadka with us today. Bimal is an emergency specialist doctor trained in the UK. He graduated from medical school in Eastern Nepal and was an Oxford Scholarship recipient for clinical neuroscience. Dr. Khadka joined Physicians for Social Responsibility Nepal and was an active participant in efforts after the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. He was elected as an international IPPNW student representative in 2014 and played a key role in the expansion of the student movement in IPPNW with various projects. He has also served as deputy board chair from 2020 to 2023, where he coordinated an IPPNW bike tour. He works hard to bridge the gap between generations, the global North and South, and to collaborate with various partners to develop a movement of young doctors and students who share the common goal of creating a more peaceful and secure world, free from the threat of nuclear annihilation, climate change, and armed violence. Anjali is Director of Campaigns with the Climate Emergency Unit and is the Director of the Padma Center for Climate Justice. The Padma Center is a hub for diasporic communities across Canada to build power around issues of climate and economic justice. Anjali has worked as a climate activist and campaigner for over a decade, consistently engaging in public discourse and media around issues of climate justice, internationalism, social movements, and BC and federal climate policy. Her work ranges from community organizing to high-level national campaigning to electoral politics, and she ran for federal office in 2021 and provincial leadership in 2022, both times bringing a strong climate justice platform to her campaigns. Anjali will speak to us first on how it's time for the climate movement to become an internationalist force against war.
Thanks so much, Linda, for the introduction. And actually, your context piece was sort of perfect in setting up what I'm going to say. So I'm going to repeat some of what Linda said because it was a great historical context for this incredibly crucial conversation about militarism and climate and what that means for the multilateral COP process moving forward. I really think that, well, first of all, I want to introduce myself. I'm Anjali. Thanks for the intro. And I'm calling in from unceded Coast Salish lands on Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish territory, also known as Vancouver. And I work with an organization called the Climate Emergency Unit, and I also run the Padma Center for Climate Justice. So I think this conversation is so timely, and it's something that we've been working on forwarding ourselves. It's I'll let you all in that on the fact that this year the Climate Emergency Unit is going to be focusing a lot more on messaging, on political messaging that has to do with exactly this topic. Of course, the Climate Emergency Unit was founded on a war metaphor in a different way, so it's quite appropriate, I think, that we do that. I really think the climate justice movement, we found ourselves in a discombobulated moment right now. A lot of our campaigns a lot of the wins that we've worked very, very hard for decades are being rolled back in in moments with the current situation south of the border and an impending conservative swing here in Canada, potential conservative swing here in Canada. I'm not gonna call that a given. And I think that our movement, this conversation has been happening for a while. Our movement needs to pivot. It needs to evolve. And I think that naming these links, these deep links between war and militarism and the climate struggle are crucial. It's sort of the next frontier of our work. Also, given the fact that we came out of the past 14 months of watching a genocide unfold in Gaza, and that's a huge part of this as well. So I'll touch on that a little bit. The fossil fuel industry and war are like two wheels of a cart. They need each other. And it's not something that we have focused on a lot as a movement, but it's absolutely always working in the background. The fossil fuel industry uses war as a tool to manipulate markets, to force compliance, to ensure continued dependency on fossil fuels. We have clear documented cases for decades of oil interests funding unrest, of funding civil war, civil unrest, domestic terrorism, as well as these much larger global conflicts, as a way to ensure that to manipulate the markets, to maximize the markets for themselves, and in turn, war itself uses tons of fossil fuels, many of which, as Linda spoke to, are exempted under most carbon accounting tools and frameworks, and they go unreported. Because militaries by nature are deeply unaccountable, even the ones that have a little bit of transparency that you spoke about, Canada and the US have a little bit more reporting requirements. Even those are woefully inadequate. So we don't even know how much carbon war uses. And that is in addition to our already quite precarious carbon budget. As Linda mentioned, it's about 5.2 to 5.5% of global emissions, and that's on the conservative side. When the war in Ukraine started in 2021, we saw a massive spike in energy prices. Just from October 2021 to August 2022, crude oil prices spiked by over 50%, between 52 to 56% globally, causing, whole chain reaction of effects globally. I mean, we saw it at the pump and in our energy prices here in Canada, but places like Sri Lanka, which declared bankruptcy during that conflict, while the markets were in flux after the invasion of Ukraine, they defaulted on their debt, and it was for a number of reasons. There was existing colonial debt. This is all part of the sort of nasty potion of the climate crisis. There was existing post-colonial debt owed to the IMF. There was a massively import-dependent economy also set up as a post-colonial legacy, and then energy prices went up so much that it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the whole country defaulted. And I was hearing stories like from folks in Sri Lanka. People were lined up for hours just to get a little bit of oil to heat their food. It was impossible to get your car fueled, so people couldn't use their cars, et cetera, et cetera. And then, over the past 14 months in Gaza, the damage has been unfathomable. There's almost no way of counting not only the emissions from that conflict, but the carbon cost of rebuilding that much infrastructure. It's the equivalent to several small countries. And that's a devastating outcome of an already devastating situation. And we've seen statements from the U.S. government and from Israel that there are oil interests in Gaza, there are offshore oil interests, and that's a huge part of the unrest as well. So what we know now is that we've known it for a while, is fossil fuel companies have consolidated their power into a global oligarchy. We see, things like the relationship between Putin and Exxon. They awarded Rex Tillerson, the CEO of Exxon, the highest, what was it called, a friendship award or something like that, a high honor. Um, and they are so deeply embedded in our body politic here in Canada and in the US. We have sort of petropopulism alive and well in places like Alberta. We have a lot of um, oil-funded community groups, astroturf groups that some excellent research across Canada has shown to be, a vast network across the country that's operating to build more of a culture around oil, to embed oil in our national consciousness and to couple oil with a national identity, which is a very powerful tactic. And fossil fuel companies have worked very hard to establish that oligarchy in soft power and hard power ways. And now they can ride the wave of global crises in a way that maximizes their profit, hopping sort of from one crisis to another. And it's up to us to recognize and to be able to interrupt that pattern. And it's up to us as the climate movement to, many of us in this movement do come from anti-war movements back in the day. I think that was a little bit before my time, but it's something that I think we need to revive and revitalize now. We need to become an anti-war movement once again. Of course, in this moment right now, when there are shocks, so the two conflicts that I mentioned, Ukraine and Gaza, those are moments of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, right, where there's a huge period of instability, and a lot of power can get consolidated in those periods of instability. So oil and gas interests are pros at using the shock doctrine to their advantage, of using these moments of instability, moments of wartime, to make the case for expanded oil and gas development. And the politicians that are in their pockets, right here at home and around the world, do that dirty work for them. So we saw that happen. We saw that happen when the Ukraine invasion happened. We saw oil groups in Canada claiming that this was a huge part of the discourse back then, that we need pipelines and expanded oil and gas more than ever for energy sovereignty. In the face of these rising oil prices, these spiking oil prices, Canada needs to be prepared by having our own energy. That was the argument. And to an everyday Canadian who's seeing their oil prices spike, or their energy prices spike, that's a sound argument. So it's a very carefully controlled rhetoric by industry to rig markets and prices, and then blame the high. So they do the sort of price gouging thing, which is not due to the conflict. It's hard to account for, so they can chalk up the price spikes to these volatile markets and the wartime, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't know how much of that is plain and simple price gouging and how much of that is actually out of the control. So they can do that, but then blame the higher gas prices that hurt the consumer on a lack of support for the industry, which then fuels that rhetoric even more. And we're seeing that right now as we reel in the middle of this looming trade war, and we're in this moment of total destabilization from the US. We hear the same chorus of voices again, pushing for more Canadian oil and gas expansion as a way to stay independent of the US and to have our sovereignty, our economic sovereignty. And so that pattern is repeating itself. And I think it's so important for us to mark that and to hear the echoes of that from previous conflicts and to start to see the pattern and to be prepared to interrupt that pattern, to push back, to know when it's coming. Every time there's an economic shock, now it's the tariffs. In a few months, it could be something else. Every time there's like an economic shock, it's up to us to know, okay, cue the role of expert opinion and policymakers who are going to try to embed the idea of oil and gas being more needed than ever in this moment. So as long as we are addicted to fossil fuels, and we know this, I think the audience here is pretty well versed. As long as we are addicted to fossil fuels, we will maintain the conditions for war and unrest and oversized power in the hands of a few powerful oligarchs. And that's the truth at the heart of the dysfunction within the COP process as well. Last year, the COP in Azerbaijan, the host country, and the host country has a lot of power in the COP process for the whole year preceding the COP and the COP itself. Their oil exports made up 95% of their economy. They were a completely oil dependent nation. And that's following the previous one of the previous COPs where there was an oil CEO who was the chair of the conference. So as long as the process remains absolutely riddled with fossil fuel interests, at last year's COP, actually, and this is where I'll end. The ratio of civil society to fossil fuel lobbyists from Canada, or in the whole conference, I think it was like 1 to 28 or something like that, something crazy like that. The Canadians, the oil lobbyists far outnumbered the climate activists. So as long as the process remains riddled with fossil fuel interests, the process is going to be deeply, deeply flawed. And we're watching it break down in real time, which is quite devastating to watch as someone who's followed that process for 15 years and really rallied on the side of developing countries. So I'll leave it there. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anjali. That's a very insightful and really enlightening perspective that you've brought us with lots of food for thought there. Bimal will speak to us next about his experience at COP29 last November, where he attended both the health and peace sessions, I believe. Thank you, Bimal.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Anjali. Yes, I can confirm you that there were far more fossil fuel lobbyists in the last COP in Baku than the total NGOs delegates over there. So they were prioritized, and it was also during the Dubai COP28 a year before, they were prioritized and given a platform in a vast amount. Thank you. I'd like to share my slides and then I will go through it. My name is Bimal. I am based in Kent, London, here at the moment. And it's around 1:30, I believe. Sorry if I'm a bit sleepy. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you. So, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone who've been listening to us and watching us. It's an honor to be with you today to discuss about the most pressing issue of our time. As my colleague have already touched and spoken on various aspects, I will be mostly dealing on the intersection of health, particularly the context of COP process. As myself being A&E doctor, I think that suits me well. I will be focusing on the medical call to action. As we navigate the complexities of the global climate challenges, it is imperative that we recognize how deeply they are intertwined with the human well-being, equity, and justice. Let me begin by framing the urgency of discussion here. Climate change is not just only the environmental crisis, but it is a health emergency. And I think WHO General Director rightly said, climate crisis is a health crisis. So rising temperature, extreme weather events, and disrupted ecosystems are not only impacting the lives of millions of people around, but they are also causing a havoc. So today, I think we need to recognize that climate crisis is health crisis and it demands urgent and radical action. As we are also focusing on the planetary health, I would like to go on it as well. Just going to the next slide. So, mostly the medical imperative, the direct and indirect health impacts of the climate change. So the planetary health is understanding that human beings is inseparable from the health of the ecosystem. Previously, we used to have it thinking that health for all the individuals around the world needs a health, and they need to have access to health. And I think it was adopted in the Alma-Ata conference as well in 1970s, 80s. But now we're going beyond that. I think it's also the ecosystem, the planet Earth, that needs to be taken into consideration. And that's how the concept of planetary health or the climate medicine comes into play. Raising temperatures and air pollutions, as you've been hearing, the pollution in Delhi, Lahore, they have to close down the school for that. And raising rate of asthma and COPD and respiratory illnesses. I think in coming years, it will be far more than the cardiovascular disease because of the climate change. And these are the medical emergencies because of the climate change. Heat waves, record heat waves, temperature, as you've been noticing. And one has to understand, if you look into the medical perspective of the temperature, mostly the vulnerable populations or the extreme of ages, either the elderly population or the newly born neonates or infants, even the decimal change of temperature impacts their physiological activities, and it can affect the kidneys, dehydration, and leading to death. And I think the cases of deaths because of the heat waves are increasing every year. Beyond that, we also look into vector-borne diseases. The dengue, malaria, mostly in the developing countries, is quite rampant. So, what role the organizations like IPPNW can play? I did have an opportunity to represent IPPNW for last two COPs, and we've been accredited by United Nations to attend the event. And hopefully this year we'll be in Brazil as well. So usually what we do, well, many say that it's a flawed process, the COP, why the doctors need to be there, why the medical professionals and the other activists need to be there. Well, I would say there are some good outcomes as well by getting into COP. Well, after 27 years, we got a health day in COP 28 in Dubai a year before, where we were given a platform to be at the center of negotiations because of the climate change, it's the forefront, the workers, the medical professionals, they would be the first one to have to deal with it because of the consequences to health, as they've been dealing with the pandemic and the COVID. So the leadership of WHO and their consideration to keep into the negotiating table as a health being the center, I think this has given us a big platform to engage with the policymakers and to take into the consideration of air pollutions because of the fossil fuel or the military emissions that you discussed earlier, how it's hampering the environment. But we also noticed that there are always the big elephant in the room, mostly the military industrial complex, the fossil fuel, and now the nuclear power energy companies. I think they've been given much more platform, and each and every SDG, Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations program, they've been incorporated with each and every programs of SDG. And the IAEA is playing an active role in it, and they are promoting nuclear power as a green energy, but I think it's a false solution. They are ignoring the legacy of the thyroid cancer, radioactive waste, and the atomic weapon proliferation. And that is why the IPPNW is there to highlight and encourage the disarmament. And let me share you one interesting story regarding the banana. This was in Baku last year. So we had some encounters with the nuclear fossil fuel activists. They used to carry the banana in the corridor early morning at 9 o'clock, and they used to give the banana to each and every individual. Oh, we have a banana. The banana is more radioactive than if you live near a nuclear power plant for a year. We were quite surprised because in the United Nations Forum, they were given us such a big platform to spread the propaganda of all those things. And that's such an absurd radiation from a plant like eating a banana. Let me be clear, I think no banana ever caused a Fukushima or Chernobyl incident, and the people are still suffering from it. Those were the pitfalls of the COP. However, as a medical professional and health being the part of the COP process, I think it gives an ample of opportunities to advocate. And I think the IPPNW did play the important role during the Cold War as well to highlight the danger of the nuclear war. And at the moment, I think in 21st century, the nuclear war and the climate change is the most existential threat for the humankind. And I think we are there to raise the awareness. On the right side of the slide, you could see we are also having IPPNW World Congress. So if anyone be interested, you are welcome to join us in Nagasaki, a world without the nuclear weapons. Nagasaki as the last atom bomb city. That's for October this year. So as you could see the photos of Don't Nuke the Climate, that's myself and a few of our activists from Australia and our indigenous leader. And she's also the ICANN ambassador. So what we could do as a medical prescription of change, I think as Anjali earlier mentioned as well, we have to be less addicted to fossil fuel. I think we need to phase out fossil fuel because it not only hampers the environment, but it also hampers our health because of the air pollution. And the rising case of asthma and COPD are the prime example of it. Another one is the disarmament. As Linda mentioned, $2.4 trillion were invested in the nuclear weapons and other form of weapons in the military-industrial complex in our global arms race. I think they should invest money in the green sustainable energy rather than in the arms industry. Similarly, providing equity to the indigenous and the vulnerable populations, because they would be the one who are going to suffer the most from the climate change. And finally, mobilizing the healthcare workers to demand for climate action, because they would be the first one who are going to bear the climate crisis as they've been bearing the COVID pandemic. So finally, to conclude, what the medical leadership going to be like? So COP process had definitely elevated the health in the climate discourse, but tangible process requires a sustained effort. We must reframe climate actions through a health justice lens, prioritizing prevention, equity, and disarmament. After all, prevention is better than cure. To quote Dr. Tedros, the climate crisis is a health crisis. As a physician, researchers, and advocates, we hold a unique credibility to drive systemic change. We need to raise our voice to demand bold action, not just ourselves, but for the future generations. I think most of us has lived our life. I mean, maybe I have lived half of my life, but it's much more the grandkids and the other generations to come because the rise in the temperature will be, even a 1 degree rise in temperature will be very harmful for them. Together, we can build a world where human and environment health are safeguarded, a world rooted in fairness, resilience, and hope. And I think we need to conclude saying that climate crisis is a health crisis. Thank you.